Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, a shock offensive by rebel forces in Syria.
There is a lot of happiness. It's indescribable, the happiness of liberating the city of Aleppo. We have been waiting for this for 10 years.
So, with the lines of conflict redrawn, where does Syria's civil war go next? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take. After years of a static war, Syrian rebel forces seized control of Aleppo over the weekend.
For the first time in 8 years, rebel forces have entered Aleppo, Syria's second largest city.
Along the way, the fighters say they freed political prisoners and even took control of the headquarters for the city's police force. And hours earlier, they took control of a highway that links Aleppo to the capital Damascus that's been used by government forces to transport weapons.
And now they're pushing further toward the city of Hama.
The joy is indescribable, this resident said. God willing, Aleppo is just the beginning.
It's a move that surprised many, even those who follow Syria on a daily basis, like my guest today.
My reaction to the news was a mix of shock and hope. The moment areas of Aleppo and eastern Idlbi were liberated, displaced families have packed their bags and, closed their tents and just went back to their homes, which give you an indication about how much really people are invested in this, but shows you how much people really, even 14 years after Syria's uprising, they still have hope and democracy and building a Syria without Assad family. My name is Qutaiba Idlbi. I'm the Syria lead at the Atlantic Council and a senior fellow with the Middle East programs. I lead the Atlantic Council's work on Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan.
Qutaiba grew up in Syria and was detained multiple times by the Assad government. He ultimately fled to the U.S. in the middle of 2011 with his brother. Qutaiba, welcome to The Take. With everything that's going on in the world right now, I think the fall of Aleppo by rebel forces might have caught a lot of people off guard. The war in Syria has been relatively quiet for the last few years, with the Syrian government and opposition groups in something of a stalemate, right? But this is obviously a complicated and messy situation. So for those of us in the audience who maybe haven't been following this as closely for the last few years and have lost track of things, could you briefly catch us up, give us a reminder of how we got to this point?
Sure thing. So this all started in 2011 with a popular uprising across all of Syria that turned quickly into a civil war as the government in Damascus responded with extreme violence against protesters.
At least 15 people are dead after fighting overnight between Syrian security forces and army defectors. Increasing numbers of soldiers are joining the opposition, calling for President Bashar Assad to step down.
Rebels captured tanks, armored vehicles, and truckloads of munitions after 4 days of intense fighting with government forces. It was one of their biggest hauls of weapons since the uprising began,
which required the Syrian government, the Assad regime, to ask for the intervention of Russia and Iran to help them basically cement their control in the country.
For 13 years, Russia and Iran provided weapons and personnel to defend the Assad government.
By 2015, Russia intervened militarily fully to support the regime, and by 2018 to 2020, Russia was able to gain back most of the country in favor of the Assad regime. Since then, in 2020, Turkey and Russia signed a ceasefire agreement that kind of cemented the different areas of control between the regime, the opposition, and the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria. And we've been kind of witnessing a frozen conflict since then, where front lines were not moving, but there were always some escalations on some fronts, some bombardments in different areas, without really any shift in what areas each party controls.
And so given that the conflict was essentially frozen, as you say, for the last few years, the way in which Syrian rebels took control of Aleppo within the past week came as a real shock to many people. How did they do it? And I guess the big question for a lot of us right now is, why now?
Certainly. I think on the why now, which is very important, for many of us who haven't been watching Syria, a lot has actually been happening on local level. Since October 7th, in a sense, the Assad regime and its allies have been utilizing the attention in Gaza and Lebanon to increase pressure on areas controlled by the opposition in northwest Syria. Daily bombardment, targeting of schools, of markets. Actually, one day before this operation started, the regime bombed a school in Ariha of Idlib, killing children while they were in school. So there has been kind of like this boiling environment in northwest Syria. We're talking about an area with more than 4 million people in it. Of course, high levels of inflation, of, not a lot of jobs around. So there has been actually a lot of demands locally. There has been a local survey that was done earlier this year, where over 60% of the population have been asking the rebels to do a military operation to control the heights around, and strategic locations around this area, to prevent the regime from using suicide drones and artillery to target civilian areas. But how it came together, I think there was also the geopolitical moment that HTS and the rebels in that area have really took notice of. Hezbollah and Iranian militias were in a very weak point where Israeli airstrikes across Lebanon and Syria has really decayed their military control and their ability to really respond on multiple fronts. And what the rebels did over 6 months ago is actually started preparing for this operation as they noticed really a lot of weaknesses points in the regime defense lines. Fighters from all the different rebels were pulled into Idlib. They went through extreme training. Actually, many fighters were turned back because they were not prepared enough to do this. And the main goal of the operation, according to different sources on the ground, was just to control Aleppo city. Again, taking leverage of this geopolitical moment and trying to not only protect civilians in Idlib, but gain political leverage that would be helpful in the negotiations if the political track is coming back alive.
So I want to make sure our audiences understand who we're talking about here, because, the term Syrian rebels or opposition forces are sort of thrown around, casually, but they're actually pretty broad. This offensive has been led by a group that you just mentioned called HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Who are they and how have they emerged as the leader among rebel forces?
So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham started in 2012 as Jabhat al-Nusra. And it's basically a group of Syrian fighters who joined Al-Qaeda in 2003 and after, following the US invasion of Iraq. They fought alongside Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then what was so-called back then the Islamic State in Iraq. And then in 2011, a small group of them returned to Syria, utilized their network to establish the Al-Qaeda off branch in Syria. In 2016, they decided to break off from Al-Qaeda. And not only did they break their ties, but also I think they moved really ideologically more center as the conflict has changed. So we've seen while, for example, when Nusra started over 10 years ago, they had like very strict way of governance of what they wanted to see in terms of social practices and governance practices. To today, we have witnessed, for example, in the last 2 years, Jolani, the head of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, welcoming back Christian and Druze communities back into Idlib, rebuilding places of worship for both communities, making special assurances and protections for them. Now, when they entered Aleppo, their communication was with the heads of the churches in Aleppo, assuring them basically full protection and, freedom of worship and practice. So today, why everyone is calling this operation under the brand of Syrian rebels or Syrian opposition? This operation, yes, is led and organized by HTS. But when the operation started, it was also prepared and joined by 11 different rebel groups. Today, what is so different and why the term Syrian rebels or Syrian opposition is more relevant is because as soon as this operation started and made a lot of advances, a lot lot of the Free Syrian Army or local resistance groups that laid down their weapons have reorganized themselves and joined the fight. So while HTS is the one leading the main operation in Aleppo, while it's definitely dominating the public scene, the reality on the ground is shifting quickly to those moments of 2011 and 2012 where we do have this popular resistance movement.
That's super interesting. I mean, you can't just all of a sudden overtake Aleppo. You have to have weapons. You have to have some sort of funding. So who is backing them?
So in terms of backing first, those groups have been, of course, accumulating weapons and ammunition because they were manning the front lines between those areas and regime-held areas. And most likely, even though the Turkish government wouldn't publicly admit that, they have been basically funded and equipped by Turkey. Not to conduct this operation, but in a sense, just to conduct the daily operations of fighting back and preventing the regime from taking more areas in Northwest. Because Turkey is interested in making sure that no more Syrian refugees are making their way into Turkey. I think Turkey has definitely known about this operation. They gave tacit approval of this operation. But as we look at open source intelligence about what's happening on the ground, about the fight itself, we haven't really seen evidence of actual military support from Turkey for this operation. So we haven't seen, for example, Turkish artillery participating or Turkish drones. What is really interesting is we have seen usage of locally developed drones, which appears to be developed in cooperation or at least copying models of Ukrainian drones. This has been very clear. So we can talk about at least lessons learned from Ukraine. I think there are a lot of questions of whether there are connections of those between those operations and any direct or indirect Ukrainian support, for sure. But as of actual military support from Turkey, I think the evidence is very limited that there was heavy Turkish support for this operation to start with.
So Turkey may have their own reasons for involvement, but what do the groups themselves want out of this?
I think for the rebels themselves, the limited goal to start with was control of the city of Aleppo and control the heights around the area, which give the regime strategic locations to bomb areas of northwest Syria. I think right now the goal has really shifted. And I think that as the operation moved south, I think the opposition, this coalition of HTS and just disorganized rebels have shifted to actually take control of as much as possible, especially in central Syria. It is, in a way, I think, a scary moment in a sense that for the opposition, the goal is expanding a lot, but it's really not clear how much they would be able to really control, if they actually would be able to swallow as much as they are biting.
More with Qutaiba after the break. So Qutaiba, let's talk about the reaction to all of this. Over the weekend, President Bashar al-Assad said his forces will continue to defend the government's, quote, stability and territorial integrity against terrorists and their supporters. And over the years, Assad has had help from outside forces. He's had help from Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, to be specific. And Russia has come again to its aid over the past few days, launching airstrikes in Aleppo for the first time since 2016. Iraqi militias have also reportedly entered into Syria to help Syrian forces. With external support like that, where do you think that things could go from here? And what's at stake?
I think the biggest question for Assad is how much support he can get militarily and politically. I think on a military level, Russia is really bogged down in Ukraine. And the effective support that they can send to Assad is actually teams of air force that can really support ground operations, because this is the only way Assad can gain territory back. But that can come at a great expense for Russia, because they're really in need of all of their air force to maintain their operations and advances in Ukraine. So any intervention in Syria on that level from Russia will actually result probably in some losses in Ukraine. So I think this is the calculation in Moscow. I think as long as the operations from the opposition are not really completely threatening the regime, but rather just changing the balance of power, I think Russia would stay away from really investing heavily in Syria, as long as the rebels, for example, are not at the doors of Damascus. Because from Putin's perspective, they can come back anytime then, break the ceasefire agreement again, and try to win those areas back. I think the big question for Iran is how much assets they can move around. And definitely, I think the challenge for them is that Hezbollah feels very exposed to the extent that they wouldn't be capable of moving assets around from Lebanon or different areas of Syria to Aleppo today. As we know, there has been an attempt to move, for example, personnel, and then there were unknown airstrikes on Al-Bukamal, on convoys of Iraqi militias trying to enter Syria. I think the only piece left for Assad is the political support. In the last 2 days, I think the Assad regime has been able to garnish support from UAE, from Saudi, from Jordan, from Egypt, and is trying to translate that into political leverage with the US that may pressure Turkey to stop HTS and the rebels from having more advances. There is a big question whether those efforts would be fruitful, but I don't think they should be taken lightly at all. We've seen the Crown Prince of Saudi, MBS, visiting UAE, despite a lot of actually disagreements over the last few years. That is, I think, a good signal for Assad, not a good one for the opposition. But yeah, the biggest question is how much the Biden administration would be able to deliver on its promises to provide more political leverage for the regime to stop those attacks.
Finally, Qutaiba, obviously with these developments over the past week, you have Syria back in international headlines. But as someone who's from there and follows Syria closely on a daily basis, would you say that there is a sense that the world took its eyes off of Syria, effectively ignoring the situation without ever really having resolved the conflict? And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing now.
Absolutely. I mean, we're learning the same lesson again and again from the region, whether it is Gaza, whether it is Syria, whether it is other conflicts, which is you can't really just contain conflicts and just forget about them and try to focus on something else. Syria has been politically put on the back burner, and the back burner has been turned off for years now. And it is coming to bite us in the back at a moment where attention is spent somewhere else, and there are not a lot of diplomatic and political resources to put in actually resolving or managing the conflict. I think the main lesson is, especially in cases in the Middle East that are where we have conflicts that are deeply rooted in political and socioeconomical problems, is that we can't just invest politically in containing those conflicts and accept that this would be enough, for us to pivot to Asia or to pivot to global power competition. And the hope is, yes, for the next administration or for future leaderships, whether it is in the US or main capitals in the EU, that they would seriously invest in dealing with the root causes of the issue there. Because without dealing with those root causes, deeply rooted in political issues, in power sharing, I think Syria will come back and force itself on the table again and again and again.
And that's The Take. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the Al Jazeera English channel to get all the latest. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you here tomorrow.